At Royal Roads University in the School of Communication and Culture. Welcome to our webinar series. Episode 5, we'll be discussing human rights in and through sport. And I really appreciate your attendance. We've noticed we don't have the numbers that we usually have, I think because of an extended long weekend, which I think is wonderful. We all need to have those breaks. At Royal Roads, we always begin by acknowledging and thanking the First Nations communities upon whose lands we are learning and working and teaching and playing. We always want to acknowledge and thank the Lekwungen and Kusepsin people in particular, also known as Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations communities, because those are the particular unceded territories on which Royal Roads resides and on which I reside as well. I'm working from home, of course, and we haven't been at the campus for over a year now. And it's quite an anniversary, really. But I live on the same lands and very similar view, actually, that I enjoy. So this is the lagoon that is out front of our campus, the Esquimalt Lagoon, and then it looks out into the coast, the Salish Sea and the Olympic Mountains in the distance in the US. We like to give thanks, of course, and acknowledge the historical gaps that exist. And we at Royal Roads take it very seriously that we want to acknowledge some of the damages that were done and the gaps that were allowed to exist within our historical teachings. We want to try and make up for that in a spirit of reconciliation and learning and growth development. We give thanks to the ancestors, the supernatural ones, hereditary leaders and matriarchs, and creatures, big and small, for caring and looking after the rich resources and cultural teachings of the beautiful lands on which we reside. At Royal Roads, of course, we have a very interdisciplinary model, and we rely on the old growth forest and the water and trails that surround our campus. We probably rely on that for our learning and teaching more than any other campus I've ever been on, for sure. And no doubt, because it is quite remarkable what we're surrounded with. This is another body of water that I row on every day and love as equally as much as that Esquimalt Lagoon. I've coached out there on that Esquimalt Lagoon, but here's where I row as well. This is Elk Lake, and it borders on the Kusepsin lands, but also the Sartlip Nation is out in Brentwood Bay there. As mentioned, this is the old growth forest that surrounds our campus, and we spend a lot of time as teachers and learners learning from the land, learning from the natural ecosystem that surrounds us. And I always see parallels, of course, with sport. I spent much of my life and continue to spend my life in that sporting setting. And so much of what I learned through sport, I think, is echoed in the research and the work that I do at Royal Roads. And so we actually partnered with Game Plan. Game Plan is an organization funded by multiple bodies, sport governing bodies in Canada, that transitions or supports athletes as they transition from their sport career into their post-sport career, whatever that might be, as an athlete, and then into, sometimes they stay in sport, of course, but sometimes they move into other realms. And Game Plan helps them with that, with education and coaching and career development services. And so we, as a university, we like to support and welcome athletes into our programs, of course. We find them to be great thinkers and leaders based on what they've learned through their sport experience. But we also acknowledge their sport experience for credit in much the same way that we allow professional experience for credit through our special admissions program. This is one of the many gardens on our campus, but this is the Japanese garden, and the bridge within the garden holds a special spot for me because it's emblematic of the principles in our School of Communication and Culture. I always like to highlight it because I think this is one of these concepts that I learned through sport about embracing diversity, and that before you can build a bridge, you really need to mind that gap, mind and understand the differences between individuals. Before you can extend your hand or build some kind of a relationship or an actual bridge, a concrete bridge. And I love that concept. It applies in the School of Communication and Culture too. And we use this as our metaphor to remind ourselves to mind the differences before we try to bridge those. Crucial concept. And much of this webinar series is trying to highlight what sport can both teach us, but also act as a blueprint for, or an incubator for, a place where we can learn these kinds of principles and concepts that can help us in society, experiment and notice and learn in a safe setting, but then also translate or transfer that knowledge and understanding into the rest of society. So sport can offer so much, I think, to society, both for those who are participating in sport, but also those who are spectating or officiating, coaching. There's so much you can participate in within sport. It has one of the greatest reaches of any endeavor across the world. And what an opportunity. So much of my research is devoted to building quality sport, a good sport, winning better, embodying principles of fair play and human rights and learning and development when we're involved in sport, and so that it avoids that kind of win at all cost mentality or a zero-sum approach to sport. Of course, at our university, we also have a number of schools and a wide variety of programs, but they all kind of connect and hinge upon one another. And of course, I see connections to the threads of learning that sport offers as well. So we have programs in the area of development, diversity and inclusion, education, environment, equity and human rights, health, media and communication, and peace and conflict, or humanitarian studies, we've renamed it. And of course, sport has so much power, and there are so many organizations, and you'll see actually on the previous slide as well, there's so many organizations through sport that are trying to tackle these kinds of issues that are related to these kinds of concepts. Sport has huge power. And of course, we're seeing these recent cases lately, a revisiting of the Title IX, of gender equity within collegiate sport in the US. And Nancy Hogshead-Makar was on this webinar speaking highly about how we have to protect these concepts. We may legislate or introduce these concepts of equity, and then they get tarnished or corrupted or challenged, and we have to continually protect and defend them. Beautiful work internationally to create outreach through sport to those who are less advantaged, or leverage sport as a way to develop community or resources in different communities across the world, and how we can leverage our platform as athletes. And we saw the NBA athletes and soccer athletes really stepping up in this way to fight for human rights using their platform. That's something I hope we can talk about a bit more today as well. We've seen cases recently, Caster Semenya, dealing with interesting solutions or approaches to how to deal with someone who has more testosterone in their body, and how do we, address that? How can that be fair? We're wrestling with these concepts more and more. Transgender athletes, gender equity. We've watched Megan Rapinoe speak out about fair and equitable pay in pro sports. But we also saw Sedona Prince speak out against the NCAA organization for their lack of equity and parity in the treatment of women and men through that March Madness tournaments. We also saw there's so much being done about human rights in general across the world, and sport, I think, through COVID has really stepped up through the WNBA bubble and also through the NBA bubbles to leverage their platform. So let's dive in and talk a little bit more about this with our guests. And I'd like to briefly introduce, but I'm going to ask both Dr. Schneider and Dr. Fowlie, Angela and Frank, to introduce themselves a little bit more and highlight or promote various things they're involved in. So Angela Schneider and I have known each other many years. We rode together back in the 80s and still do as senior athletes, master's athletes. So fun. But Angela comes from Western Ontario University and is an associate professor in women's studies and feminist research department, also the director of the International Center for Olympic Studies, and has a recent book on doping in sport. As long as I've known Angela, that's been an interest for her, of ethics in sport and philosophy of sport. And Frank and I go actually way back too. We started to talk about programming at Royal Roads that could focus on or leverage sport more fully, and sport for development, sport for peace. And those kinds of programs are developing now. We do have one course at the grad level called Sport for Society. We had 40 registered last summer, and it'll be offered again this summer as a general studies course. So anybody who qualifies can take that course. It'll eventually expand into more of a graduate certificate in sport leadership. And we also have an undergraduate certificate, so a 1 year that could ladder into other programs in sport leadership and governance. Now that's on the horizon. Things got a little stalled through COVID. We also have a bonus reel with Pamphonette Buissa. She is a member of the Rugby Sevens team and just actually won. She was part of the team that just won the Dubai Invitational Tournament, one of their first tournaments they've ever been able to participate in since the beginning of COVID, and wonderful to see them come out on top and be the cup winners. Ferocious player, but also an incredibly ferocious activist and speaker. And so we have an interview with her about an hour or so talking about the concept of human rights in sport and also through sport, how sport can be leveraged to fight for human rights. And so let's dive in. I'll just shut down my PowerPoint and stop sharing, and let's get talking to our guests. So I'd like to begin by asking just a bit more from, let's start with Angela. What has drawn you to work in and for sport? So, you know, obviously you've been an athlete at a very high level, silver medalist in '84 Olympics, but what role and importance has sport played in your life? And I'll start with Angela, but also ask the same question of Frank, if you don't mind, just to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself as well. Thanks.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, Jennifer. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to participate with you in this seminar. It's near and dear to my heart. And sport has been a life changer for me throughout my life. So when I was young, our home had the unfortunate circumstances of alcoholism and domestic violence. And my way out of the house was onto the court, onto whatever sport I could do. At high school, I played 5 sports just because the longer I played sport, the longer I was away from home. And I liked it, and it was empowering. And there was tremendous coaching support, and there were tremendous role models. I was so fortunate in that regard. I still have a great relationship with my grade 9 physical education teacher, who's now 82, I believe. And she was my fairy godmother. And then at the university level, the only reason I went to university was to be on the track and field team. That's what I hadn't experienced rowing at that time, but I went to UWO to be on the track team. That was it. And then at 3rd year, I realized, oh, this school stuff, not so bad. This is pretty interesting. And from there, I engendered an interest in education. And in particular, I was in kinesiology and philosophy. So the experience of sport has led me to incredible transformative stages in my life. And then, of course, from the physical perspective, the pinnacle was the Olympic Games. And going into those opening ceremonies, for me personally, is only second to giving birth to my children from a point of view of the impact on my life. So it's been an incredibly important part. And it still is, as you say. It's so wonderful to row with women over 60 who are out there still giving it their all in competition, which most people just, they can't understand why 60-year-old women want to go and kill themselves competing. You know, it's a great thing.
Oh, it's a great thing. Can you tell us just a bit more about walking into that stadium and what impacted you about it? What struck you, or what kind of landed for you there?
I realized I was an Olympian. Oh my gosh. And how many times now they try, in some cases, the teams, to prevent the athletes from going because they think they're going to get tired out. It is a long process, but to rob them of that incredible life-changing experience, to see the people, the Canadian people that were there in particular, like, but all of the people, they are so loving and so supportive and so celebratory when you come in there. Like everybody is cheering, everybody is so happy for you to be there. So that moment, I realized, hey, I'm an Olympian. This is incredible. Yeah, it was so special.
It's so beautiful. I want to come back to that thread again and again, because I think, you know, what is an Olympian? What are they cheering for? You know, what did they love? But let's park that and then come back to it. I can see it being a thread all the way through. And Frank, how about you? What does sport mean to you? Why have you ended up working for sport, in sport? Because it's been a thread all through your life, I've noticed.
I'm a bit of an accidental tourist. Unlike you and Angela, I'm not an Olympian. I'm more of a volunteer and an administrator. But before I start my storytelling, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of a very important person who's watching today, Mr. Howard Stupp. Howard is a Canadian who served for 30 plus years as the Director of Legal Affairs with the International Olympic Committee. He's an Olympian, competed in Montreal in wrestling, and was the Pan Am Games champion in 1975 in wrestling. So Howard's a good friend of mine, and I'm delighted that he took the opportunity to listen to me, and he'll, I'm sure, correct me if I start to say anything that's even close to remotely wrong. So hi, Howard, and thanks for coming on. So I swam at university. I earned a black belt in Taekwondo. I was really involved with the Royal Life Saving Society and the National Lifeguard Service in those programs. And in my career, my first career was as a member of the RCMP. And at a certain point, I ended up in southern Saskatchewan in a rural detachment, where there were a couple of towns that had swimming pools. And of course, I got involved and started teaching life-saving lessons and lifeguarding, and ended up on the board of directors of the Life Saving Society. And several years later, ended up moving out to the West Coast and volunteered for the Commonwealth Games in '94, and ended up on the aquatics committee and as a protocol officer. So helped do the swim, dive, and synchro meets. Which was a bit of a life-changing experience, and then volunteered at the Pan Am Games in Winnipeg in '99, doing the same sort of thing. In 2000, I was long since out of the RCMP, but I ended up working with the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations in East Timor after the Civil War there. And several months into the job, I was nominated as the Olympic Games officer, because I was the only one that had even a meager background in sport administration. And my job was to organize the individual athletes from East Timor to attend the Sydney Olympics. Australia was a huge proponent of that because they were the largest troop contributor to the peacekeeping force. They had about 10,000 pairs of boots on the ground, and they really wanted the Timorese to participate. So there was a lot of work between the UN, the IOC, and the host committee, the SOCOG, to get Timorese athletes involved. And to have Timorese feet walk on the track at the opening ceremonies of the 2000 Olympics. And since then, I've been involved as a board member of the Sport Dispute Resolution Center of Canada. My profession is conflict resolution. That's what my doctoral work is, and I've been an ombudsman with United Nations organizations and other international bodies. So I spent a number of years on the board of the Sport Dispute Resolution Center of Canada as a mediator with the Court of Arbitration for Sport. I'm now going to be the vice chair of the Canadian Sport Institute Pacific, which is headquartered in Victoria. And 10 days ago, I was informed that I'm now the deputy chair of the first ethics commission with the Commonwealth Games Federation. So my work has been, and then I do the work as commissioner of Athletics Canada, the complaints officer with Wrestling Canada. So right now I'm kind of at a point where my passion is sport, my profession and my academic background is conflict resolution, and I'm kind of hitting a place in my life where I'm able to do both of those things at the same time.
And I want to come back to that, that role you both play of the kind of ethical neutral zone, or how do you balance the rights of people, of all people, and that kind of thing in a moment. But I want to press a little more deeply into what you talked about, because your face lit up a little bit there, Frank, when you spoke about the Timorese coming in to that stadium. So it's a very interesting parallel. That was very powerful. What does it mean to be an Olympian? Why was it so important for them to wander into that and have the support to get into that stadium?
So it was, for the Timorese, it had a lot to do with the declaration of being an independent people. For 450 years, they had been a colony of Portugal. They'd been an independent state for about 10 months, and then they were colonized by Indonesia. So East Timor is half of an island in the Indonesian archipelago. And for 25 plus years, it had been an Indonesian province, and there was a cessation vote. People voted for independence. There was a short-lived, very bloody civil war. A quarter of the population was either forced into internally displaced persons camps or over the border into West Timor. So for them, it was the first step of saying we're on the world stage as an independent people in close to 500 years. For SOCOG, for the City Organizing Committee in Australia, it was a big way for them to express to Australians their pride in what they had done in East Timor. They were the first armed force on the ground. They were the biggest contributor. They contributed logistics bases. It was the focus of the Australian people through the end of 1999 and 2000. And I can tell you, I had the honor of walking in the dress rehearsal of the opening ceremony and hearing the crowd. But when you watch the tape, the independent athletes from East Timor marched under the Olympic flag in white uniforms. No coaches, just the 4 athletes. They walked in after Greece and before Australia. And the crowd went wild. It exploded. All of a sudden, there were these 4 kids, literally that had been plucked, some of them out of refugee camps, walking on the ground as Olympians. And every person in that stand that was Australian somehow supported that through their tax dollars, through their sons or daughters being in the armed forces, through their government, through NGOs. And it was this moment of elation. So it was quite moving and extraordinarily powerful.
Beautiful. And you're mirroring those same words Angela was saying of the support, people rallying around. Wow, how beautiful. Yeah. In so many ways. And it's interesting because we tend to think of an Olympian as, Hercules, but it isn't always that, is it? Angela, can you talk a little bit more about what it meant to you, or what being an Olympian really represented?
Well, for sure, my first memories of watching an Olympian was watching Olga Korbut in gymnastics, and I was 10, I think, at the time. And I was watching her and watching that process, and we're talking a long time ago, but it stuck with me. And that was my image of an Olympian. It was her, right. As a woman, exactly. And I thought, well, I don't exactly look like Olga or fit that category, but I'm going to find a way to be there and do that experience. And it really is the case that I think being an Olympian is something that many people, especially kids, when they're playing sports, aspire to and think about. And even when it may not be fully flushed out as a definition to them, what exactly that means, one thing that does stand out is an excellence, a higher level of excellence, and a pursuit of that excellence. And I think that, so you mentioned Hercules, the ancient model, you know, Kalo Kagathea, is still something that is at the core of it, beauty and nobility. It is the core, I think, attraction to that from an individual level. So when people watch Usain Bolt and they watch these incredible performances, especially children, I think they see themselves. They envision themselves in the sense of their efforts, in the sense of what they want to do or be do. So when they go out and they role play in the, you know, I'm Wayne Gretzky, I'm doing, because it is so inspirational and they want to live on that higher level or go to that higher level. So that's just a personal take on it.
Beautiful. And the access, right? That every kid can dream and imagine. It's funny, mine was Nadia. You know, I think we have just a little difference in our ages, but that was the same. And I was reflecting on how it didn't matter where she was from. I didn't care. I wasn't going to cheer. It didn't have to be Canadian. We've kind of become more nationalistic about our Olympic cheers, I think. But back then, yeah, I didn't really think about that much. It was more about that excellence in her tens, you know. And I was just watching Olga Korbut because I was watching a movie about the terrible case of the gymnastics scandal, but Olga doing the first backflip off the bars, and amazing stuff. Oh, wonderful. And can you talk a little bit more about what's drawn you to this realm of ethics for each of you? Frank, maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, again, it's got a lot to do with my academic and professional progression and where I've worked and what I've done in the international world. And I think there's lots of overlap in things, in places. So what at a certain point, human rights layers onto civil rights, and civil rights kind of lap onto legal rights, and then legal rights sort of comes to ethical responsibility. So in a way, they kind of overlap. In acting as a neutral third, as a mediator or an arbitrator, when you look at those sorts of things, you're often weighing the same principles. Did someone treat another person with respect? Did someone act in a corrupt manner towards the organization that they're working with? Is doping robbing something of another participant, or is it really robbing the athlete of a healthy future? You know, so a lot of the questions are very similar, and it's just really the framework that you're executing the evaluation on. So something can be a human rights violation, but at the same time, it can be an ethical violation. Something can be a really severe ethical violation against another person, but may not be a human rights violation. So there's kind of this flow and ebb of where things land, and that's kind of how I've ended up on this ethics commission. My work in the UN dealt with ethical conduct in the workplace, and a lot of the frameworks that the Commonwealth Games Federation is looking at, if you look at the Birmingham staff rules, for example, they're all about who buys who supper, what kind of gift you can accept, what's the limit of hospitality versus a bribe, and those sorts of questions, which have different cultural meanings, and they have different societal meanings. You know, in some cultures, an outlandishly large gift is perfectly acceptable, and in others, less so. And so it's kind of the leveling of that in terms of an organization or a sport that is the question. And folks like me that are neutral thirds, our job's to kind of figure that out.
And clearly builds on your strengths as a human being. You know, you're drawn to being, and you're obviously very good at being at weighing and considering the whole. And do you feel like you drew on your sport, your martial arts, and your swimming in that regard as well? I'm just interested.
Well, I think it's obviously had a lot to do with my sport, but it's a lot to do with my background. So I was a human rights officer in British Columbia. So I definitely have a background in that. And it has had a lot to do with my professional work overseas and dealing with ethical conduct. Certainly the martial arts experience, the respect of other, the respect of participants, of coaches, of seniors, develops an ethical framework in a slightly different manner than perhaps it does in other sports. But I think it's more a lived experience than one that's been imposed by a participation in a particular set of sports.
Yeah. It all just echoes and builds on itself. Yeah. And it always strikes me in sport how it embodies so many of these concepts of just fairness, respect. You know, it can definitely be corrupted, but at its heart, you have that protocol.
Yep.
Beautiful. And Angela, how about you? How did you arrive in that space? Philosophy of sport. And it was interesting, you know, the balance of the kinesiology and philosophy. And some people would think, oh, those don't really fit together, but of course they do. And can you describe how you found the marriage, those two things fit for you?
Yeah, it was a really interesting discovery because I was in first year university and I decided to take as an elective a philosophy course because I liked some of the questions that it had the course outline, you know, about what is important and meaningful in life and what is the good and these kinds of things. And I had never had the opportunity in any educational setting to talk about that. So I went to this class and I fell in love with this study. I mean, the first thing this professor, and I still remember this professor very clearly in my head saying to me, you know what Socrates was trying to get people to think about? He's trying to get people to think about their death. How do they want to die? How do they want their life to have played out at the end so that they can stand back and say, did I get that right? How can I get that right? You know, and how many times do we give students the opportunity to think about that, because it's scary, you know, in the sense that nobody wants to think about their death. But in fact, it's actually when you think about your death that you realize the importance of ethical issues, because you're thinking about the big picture and you're thinking about how I want to live my life. And so I got hooked in that moment in philosophy. But at the time, which was in the early 80s and late 70s and early 80s, physical education, kinesiology, and philosophy were quite separate. And there were stereotypes with it too, right? So the people in kinesiology and physical education had the stereotype of the sort of meathead, but the big bodies. And then the philosophers had the stereotype of no bodies, but the big brains, you know? So anyway, it was a really interesting experience. And when I started my graduate degree in the philosophy department and I came back from the Olympics, I was challenged to an arm wrestle within 2 weeks of being in the program. And I'm going, I'm here to study philosophy, but if you want me to beat you in an arm wrestle, I'll do it for some beer. Anyway, so I was astounded by that. So I found the whole discussion really, I lived it in the experience of going back and forth between the two departments. And really, I decided to do my dissertation on the Ben Johnson scandal. And in that decision, I had to do a whole load of comprehensive exams on ethical theory, metaethics, and how do we grapple with these kinds of moral dilemmas. And no one in the philosophy department wanted to supervise me because I was doing Ben Johnson. They were like, yeah, we can do abortion, we can do euthanasia, we can do these other questions, but sport? And finally, a senior professor said that he would supervise it. And I think the only reason they approved it was because I had a silver medal, frankly, because they didn't see sport as having serious ethical issues. You know, so this Ben Johnson guy, he cheated and he doped. So what's the big ethical issue here? So that was a great learning experience. And to see the diversity in scholarship on this topic, you know, and to be frank, the stereotype we have of the Sheldon Cooper in some of these discussions, people lose people in the theory in some of these important discussions, and others who are living it in, like when the rubber hits the road in real life situations, sometimes find that discussion inaccessible or unusable. And so I've spent my life trying to bridge that. And that's what my research is about, bridging the theory and the practice on ethics and human rights, and why sport is one of the most important areas for learning and teaching and talking about ethics.
Absolutely agree. And you make a really neat point about the opportunity to think about these things. And I think I'm pressing for that in the role I play, for sure, that athletes should be thinking. I don't think I didn't reflect as much as you did, obviously, on the Ben Johnson, but over the course of my life I have. And it has been so seminal. But it would have been nice to be a more intentional and facilitated, as athletes to be reflecting. And it's lovely to see during COVID, so many athletes truly thinking, hey, and reflecting on their role, the role that sport plays. Wonderful to see. And so in what ways do you see human rights being particularly relevant in sport? So you mentioned especially in sport, and Frank, what do you think about that? Why do you think human rights are particularly relevant in sport? You seem to keep stumbling back into the sport realm. It seems like you're completely surrounded by sport right now, and asked to do so many roles, but yeah. Well,
I think you have to take a step back and understand what human rights are first.
Thank you.
It's treating other human beings with equality, and the lack of discrimination, the absence of discrimination, and the positive approach of equality. And I think sport can be so helpful from that across the whole spectrum. When you look at high-level events like the Olympic Games, the Commonwealth Games, the Pan Am Games, and you see people of different ages, races, genders, sexes, all competing with the same set of rules, the same ability of access, then that's really important. So sport can be a model for society. Sport can be a model for the elders to learn from. I reflect on the folks with Right to Play that developed a mixed Palestinian-Israeli soccer team of youth, and how that turned out to be a cultural and learning experience for the participants, and how that changed the lives of those 20-odd kids that were involved. But that creates a model for the statesman. That creates a model for the politicians to say, well, the kids can do it, why can't we? And one of the things I'm seeing, I think, in the modern world is that it's sport in some ways, instead of being the vehicle, is becoming a chess piece. It's becoming moved by exterior forces to create discussions about human rights and what they are. So presently we have all of this discussion going on around Beijing 2022, and should there be boycotts, and what do boycotts mean? That's based on this idea that certain people that are in the Chinese state are being treated in a way that's discriminatory, and they're not being treated with the same level of equality of other people within the state. And so how can sport be used to help shine a light on that, or create less discrimination? And that's a really difficult question, because athletes are going to have a different perspective than international organizations, than politicians. Aaron O'Toole has described what he thinks is the appropriate thing to do, but I don't know if he actually has talked to someone who's going to be on that Olympic team to see whether they think it's a good idea, or he's actually talked to a Uyghur to see what they think. So sport has the power to, as you well described and as Angie well described about walking onto that 400-meter track at the opening of an Olympic Games, has the ability to capture the human spirit and the human attention. And by doing things that create equality and break down barriers of discrimination, sport can certainly add a lot to the human rights movement.
Thank you. Thank you. And what do you think, Angie? What would you like to add to that? Why sport in particular? You know, and I love that vehicle chess piece, the in and the through. So there are issues within sport like Beijing, but it can also be a place where we can, through sport, we can have an impact and make a statement. Okay.
So there's positive rights to do things, and there's rights to be protected from things being done to you that are harmful. And those come up in sport, I think, on two levels. But I also think human rights in sport goes back to a child at a fundamental level in the playground when they say, and that's not fair. Wait a minute, and that's not fair. And it is a passion, and it hits them, and it's like, you cheated. You know, this is a violation, a fundamental violation between you and me. You know, we have an agreement and you broke it. So I think sport actually at a really fundamental level can express the passion about human rights within sport itself intrinsically. So I think Frank quite rightly identified the extrinsic and the external, and the way sport can be a vehicle for advancing human rights. And we also know all about all the problems within sport for violations of human rights, but also the experience of sport itself, I think, can be an expression of human rights. So I met Hans Lenk, who is a sport philosopher. I met him when he was 80, right? So he was in that German gold medal 8 that was stern for East Germany, bow for West Germany, and they hated each other's guts, he told me. He said, we, you know, totally politically, but they got in that boat and they decided that they were going to take this experience, work together, bond together, and pull out an excellent, outstanding performance and win a gold medal and overcome those incredible diverse, you know, differences that they had to do. So what other places in the world or examples in the world do we get that kind of really deep, passionate, and fundamental commitment that you have to make to do that? You know, you're putting yourself on the line. And so I think that it really does provide a vehicle, but I think also intrinsically and inherently, especially through the concept of fair play, leads people to understand the depth of human rights and the issues related to it. For me, it's I know, Jennifer, you and I worked on a project a few years ago where you kindly hosted with me at Royal Roads on a shirk project. And the 5 themes that we as a group at that time identified were gender rights, Indigenous rights, parasport rights, the right to fair and clean sport, and the right to safe sport. So I think that those core issues still run through, and sport can be a vehicle that is a positive thing, or sport can be a vehicle that can create and cause harm, like the examples in the gymnastics. The problem I have had is that there has been so much bashing of sports. They're throwing the baby out with the bathwater on this. There have been horrible examples, absolutely. And there's really serious violations that have to be dealt with, and dealt with severely. But that doesn't mean sport itself can't be a wonderful vehicle and expression of celebrating human rights.
I think really importantly, one of the things that sport does is it gives you an understanding of the other. You know, if you're at the Olympic Games and you're in the Olympic Village with 10,000 other athletes and you're seeing their food in the cafeteria and you're sitting down at the table with them and you're asking about their country and their life, and you get that exposure to other people, other cultures. And it goes from the same thing from kids playing hockey in outdoor rinks in Saskatchewan from one town to the next, where they're meeting kids they don't go to school with. And they ask, their one father farms beef and the other one farms wheat, and they talk about their lives, and they share experience and they learn about the other. And I think sport has that incredible ability to do that. One of the most powerful things, I think, and this is one of your later questions, but I'm going to throw it in now because it's kind of a good point, is when we saw the integration of parasport into the Commonwealth Games. There wasn't an Olympic Games and a Paralympics. There was one Commonwealth Games with parasport included in the schedule. The other stopped being very different. The other were other competitors, not another class of athletes. And that's really breaks down that barrier of discrimination and treating people with a lack of equality. And I think that's hugely powerful in sport.
I'd like to, Jen, can I jump in there on the other? I just love that, Frank. I use this metaphor in my classes to explain how much we need our opponents and the other. And the metaphor is the touchstone. A philosopher who developed this idea said, it's the way I test my metal. So the touchstone in geology is the one you strike to see what the other one's made of. So it's in that striking that I understand who I am and what I am. But I need that opponent, that other, to take me to that other level. They are my touchstone. And in sport, you really understand that. You can't have the game without them. You can't have the experience without them. And in understanding their otherness, you don't even need the same language. So at the Olympic Village, Frank, so examples, we when we had the Korean women come for the first time to the LA Olympics, so we're on this bus. I'm going to tell you the story. Sorry if it takes up a little bit of time. We're on the bus to go from the Olympic Village to Lake Casitas, which was a fairly long drive, especially in traffic. And the CHIPS guys were patrolling beside us, and we're getting there. And all there are is porta potties set up out there. And this sculler from South America, who I called the peacock, just thought he was God's gift to the world and to women, walked right in front of the Korean women who were standing in line, respecting the line to go into the porta potty. And I watched him walk and cut in front of them. And I looked at them and I went, I could not speak Korean. And I went, let's push this thing over. Well, he I couldn't. And they were just like, oh, no, you can't do that. But we didn't have to speak. It was a violation and a disrespect on a level that I was flabbergasted by, coming from Canada, and talk about the other, not knowing different cultures. And for them, it was not, they were, anyway, it's quite an experience about learning the other and not even speaking their language.
I love that. Shared international indignation.
That's right.
And it had nothing to do with figure skating.
Exactly. I'm so glad you brought up the opponent, the value of the opponent, the learning of the other, and the striking, that idea of the touchstone. I'm so glad you reminded me of that. It's beautiful. I've heard you speak about it before, and I think I'd lost it, but that importance of trying to explain to people that sport isn't bad, it isn't the sport that is bad. Nothing's bad. Thinking makes it so. And competition is not, it's very collaborative. It needs to be facilitated though, right? There needs to be leadership to ensure that that is done in a way where we can learn these things where, kids do see, they are oriented toward possibility, or they do see the possibility is available to them, or that competition can be really positive and healthy and helpful and graceful. You don't need to hate someone to compete with them, right? Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, let's just keep going. And can you tell me, I wanted to touch base with Frank a little bit about this idea too of We could dive into some of these current, human rights issues. We go there. Why don't we go there? Because we're kind of touching on that. Some of these, like gender, like political unrest, and we're thinking, man, should they be allowed to host an Olympics if they're treating their citizens so terribly? And how do we wrestle with some of these questions? So you've mentioned Beijing, Frank. Are there other human rights issues that are really resonating for you, or really burning for you right now, that you'd like to discuss a little further?
And I'm going to sort of mix this answer with another question I know you're going to ask, and that's sort of like the spectrum of human rights and the continuum of human rights. So right now, when we're talking about the Olympics, we're talking about a fairly advanced place in sport, and we're talking about some fairly precise issues. But human rights in sport is more than that high level stuff. Human rights in sport, in my experience in the UN system, is what do you do in a refugee camp? How do you support the Millennium Development Goals of health and education? And can sport be a vehicle to do that? And is sport actually a human right when you're a refugee in a trans-border tent set up by the UN High Commissioner on Refugees? So there's that broad spectrum, and then at one end we have discussions about hyperandrogenism, and at the other end we have human rights violations where the human right is, are you killed or not? Do you have the right to stay alive because you support this team or this philosophy? There's the example of the Gaddafi's son killing the coaches of the soccer team because they lost. So there's that broad spectrum, and the continuum is this idea that it's evolving, and so when we're talking about hyperandrogenism in 2021, if we go back to 1921, it was whether or not sport should allow women or persons of color to participate. So there's this continuum of shift and change about what the issues are, and what we're talking about now versus what was talked about 50 years ago should be different, because we should have resolved a lot of those equity and discrimination issues along the way. So right now, I think there are a couple of things that are percolating that are going to be forward issues. The first one we've talked about is these unusual situations like Castor Semenya, where you have a person that's born with something that gives them an inherent advantage over another person on the field of play, and it's not a discriminatory issue. So the example I always use in discussion is, nobody cut off Michael Phelps's arms because he had a 25-foot wingspan, and he had this inherent natural difference from other human beings in the length of his arm pole and in his vital capacity in his lungs to hold and expel breath when he was swimming. That gave him an advantage. So how does sport and how does science and how does the law look at all of these things and preserve it in a way that is respectful to the sport and to the individual? One of the things that I've read and heard of is that the number of physical examinations that Castor Semenya has had to go through to prove that she is born female. Like, how many times is that required, and how is that discriminatory towards her as a human being? So I think that's an issue. How we look at people that have some particular innate trait that nobody ever thought of before. And I think the other percolating issue, and we're seeing it, and I must say with great disgust in some areas in the United States especially, is how the trans community is being treated, and laws that are being passed that are on the face of them in our governmental system, in our Canadian mind of thinking. As Angela puts it, it's this whole idea that that's not fair. That's not good. That's not right. That's not how we should be expressing ourselves as people. So I think that's a forward-looking issue that 10 years ago, 50 years ago would never have been part of the discussion. And where we are in 20 years from now, looking back on 2021 and say, oh, wasn't that charming? And we thought that transgender was an issue at that point, and what the issues will be then. And there'll be a certain point where we're going to run out of possibilities to disagree with each other. If we're at the point where the main discussions about our differences are hyperandrogenism, or the capacity of trans athletes to compete in their new character, we're pretty far down the road. We're not shooting people to prevent them from going to an Olympic Games because they are of a particular race or dialect or those sorts of things. And it'll be really interesting to see what the going forward human rights issues are. But then there's all the external things that we've talked about. And one of the things I think that's been terrible, and Angie will probably have some comment on that, is when sport and sport facilities have been turned into places of torture. Sarajevo, how the stadium there was used as an internment camp. When I worked in East Timor, and the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights staff and investigators were first arriving there, they found that the boxing stadium was literally covered with human flesh, where it was used as a torture and an execution facility. So it's when sport and its infrastructure are turned into something that's entirely antithetical to the nature of sport, that's a huge issue. And I think that's part of the discussion that we're seeing as international actors look at things like Beijing. Why was that not an issue in 2008? They had an Olympics 13 years ago. Why wasn't the Uyghur issue something different then, important then? And I think it will change the face of sport in some ways, because I think those kinds of issues, and I'm sure Howard in his experience will have heard lots of things about these at the IOC tables about, oh my God, what are we going to do? And the other thing that's happening is the cost and the development of the infrastructure to host these major games. And I think it's going to start speaking more and more to hub cities. There will be one place in each region or each continent that sort of becomes the permanent. Vancouver will become the permanent North American Winter Games hub. And San Moritz in Switzerland, in every 4 cycles, you host it again and again to help evade those kinds of problems. On the other hand, sport adds so much. Sport has added a lot to the human rights discussion in Qatar because of the soccer events, the football events that are coming up, and how that it's probably not going to change society there, but it's shedding a light on it that may not have been shed before. I think the last thing, and it's one thing that I think is really important, is we have there is a large portion of the human population that reside, the women in the Muslim community, that are really unable to compete in sport because of the religious mores, the standards of morality and decency that are described in that. I remember 20 odd years ago, I was a guest of the Brunei Olympic Committee for a couple of days, and seeing these absolutely marvelous facilities, swimming pools, outdoor, will rival the LA campus, unused. For at least half the population, because there is no way that a woman in an Islamic country could decently go to a swimming pool and participate in diving or speed swimming. The burkini hadn't been invented yet. I don't think FIFA has approved the burkini as a swimming costume at competitions. So there are sectoral things where sport is going to impact societies, and maybe society will impact sport as well. You're muted.
And my dog was barking, so I had to shut myself down for a minute. Working from home, right? And we have to be so careful in assuming, right, that the solution is to make sure that these women can participate, because some of them don't want to, right? Like we have to be so careful to navigate. Same with para. I'm like, para should be integrated, and yet a lot of para athletes are like, we got it pretty good right now. Like, we kind of like what we can shine the light on our sports this way, so we don't necessarily want to get swallowed up. And so there's always the pro and con, and you've mentioned that many times, the whole picture, which is probably what makes you so strong as that mediator in the middle.
Maybe.
And what do you have to add there? What are some of those burning human rights cases, issues, concerns that you're finding yourself quite intrigued by right now?
So I'm teaching an Olympic issues course right now with third-year undergraduates, and the 4 biggies that we were struggling with and that the students were really engaged in was the effect of COVID-19 on athletes' rights, but also equity and access to health care around the world. Of course, the Beijing Olympics and the Uyghurs, and the question about should we boycott. The Russian doping scandal is still on the radar big time. And Rule 50, the athletes' rights to voice themselves and speak out during the Olympic Games. So those were 4 biggies during the course. But before I speak to them, I just want to talk to, if I could for a moment, to Frank's point about the spectrum. I had the experience of doing research in Cairo with a PhD student, and she was doing an analysis of Muslim women in physical activity and the rules around it during clothing, and the question of transition after menses and limitations of participation in sport. When I was there, we managed to go to where the Zabaleen live, the garbage people, right? The people who live in the garbage dumps, the poorest of the poor. These are the Coptic Christian poor. And it was mind-boggling. It was mind-boggling. So we know Doctors Without Borders. I witnessed Clowns Without Borders. And I'm going, what is happening here? Why is there a Clown Without Borders? It's because they can't offer them water, they can't offer them food, they can't offer them medication, they can't offer them housing, and they're trying to make the kids laugh and smile because they lose play. When you have all those basic needs robbed from you, you no longer have the ability to play. I was in tears. I was just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. These people are here volunteering because they can't give anything else. They'd have nothing to be able to give except to try and get the child to laugh or play or engage with whatever they had. They had stones and sticks and newspapers. I mean, this is, wow. And so this spectrum of play and the poverty was outstanding. So this is at the time when the swine flu was on, and these Abilene women, the only animal they had to feed their families was a pig, because they collected garbage and they fed the pigs, and that was their food. During the swine flu, the authorities were coming in and slaughtering their pigs. That was their food source. So the women, the mothers, were throwing themselves across the animals to stop them from killing their food source. I felt, when I was in that situation, like a voyeur. I felt like I shouldn't even be seen. I felt so ashamed as a human being that this existed, because I had no idea. So Frank, when you talk about that spectrum, I didn't know about the extremes of that spectrum till I saw that and experienced that. And wow, it is profound, and it lives with you. It's extraordinary. On the other questions, the difficulty with the China boycott this time. So what's the difference? There's a big difference from my class perspective with my students because of the anti-Asian sentiment. Mm-hmm. There is a huge anti-Asian backslash. So some of our Chinese students or international Asian students, they're suffering. They're getting persecuted. We're seeing violence against Asians. So when we say, and China does this, many people who don't understand the situation say, oh, you Asians, you're doing this. And they attack them and they don't understand the issue. So it actually has caused a reaction that didn't happen in 2008 because we didn't have the same level of anti-Asian sentiment as we do now. It's very strong. And I have two students from China, two PhD students from China, who are just suffering terribly in this situation because on the one hand, they're hearing, reading, understanding all the North American information, news, criticisms, articles, academic theories, and all about the Uyghurs. And on the other hand, they're talking to their parents at night on the phone, and it's a totally different story, right? And they're living that. Wow, like it's different. It's different. It's so. I mean, I have always been, and I still am to this day, opposed to the boycott because I'm of the view you go in and you shine the light. You go in, you shine the light, and the athletes who have this incredible power to use their social media can speak to it. Even if they get Rule 50 that they can't say it when they're on the podium, they can go on to their Instagram, they can go on to their Facebook, and people listen to them. They have these huge followings, and they can make an impact that's positive. So I'm still opposed to the boycott. I think it's up to the athletes because if it's not, then it's not a moral decision. I mean, if the government or the COC imposes on our athletes, you can't go, then it's not their choice. They're not choosing otherwise. They're not being able to say, I don't want to go because of these moral issues. They're being told that's not a moral decision. Now, the Aaron O'Toole's of the world, of course, can make that decision and impose it on the athletes, but that's what it is. It's an imposition.
Right.
They need to be asked, and they don't get asked. All of these great discussions on what's happening and how many times do they actually ask the athletes?
And yet boycotting oppression. You know?
Unbelievable. And I was in a games that was boycotted.
Yeah.
It's profound. It's profound, the effects on the athletes. It's there for their lives. So anyway, so I think this is a really interesting and important and ongoing debate, and it gets harder and harder as the human rights violations go up and up, and with our own Canadians, the two Michaels being imprisoned on top of that. It just, hard. So those are some of the challenges that we've struggled with. The pandemic, you know, what was a wonderful thing that China did offer to give everyone free vaccinations. You know what? That's an Olympic spirit. So in fact, even though in the context, people may say, well, you know, the motive might have been, you know, tainted because they're just trying to, you know, raise their corporate citizenship. Who cares as long as those people get vaccinated? Yeah. Who cares? And as long as it works, you know, so I think that there are really different issues this time on that China discussion. And the pandemic has made a profound effect. And also, Jen, the gender differences of the effects of the pandemic on athletes, on women athletes, because it is, and on the economic. It's the same as the she session happening throughout the rest of Canada. It's happening to athletes too, and there are huge gender differences on those impacts.
Yeah, talk about, you know, there's that phrase of don't waste a good crisis. Crises always shine the light on the gaps, the cracks, the opportunities, the weaknesses, but the opportunities too. And then also I'm hearing, you know, the need for leadership. So how we do it. There's one oppressive method to say, we'll boycott, or how do we leverage this opportunity to actually build what we're trying to build instead of just fighting against something we're trying to fight against. Great concepts. Any comments to add there, Frank, or responses to?
You know, just to add one more thing on future looking stuff, and this is work that my friend Howard has been doing, and that's sort of and again, it's on this far advanced side of the spectrum, but it's the idea of the integration of the Indigenous communities as independent sporting bodies. You'll know that with the World Lacrosse Championships that Ireland bowed out to allow the Mohawk Nation to be a representative country in that. And I think is a forward-looking issue. We're going to see that come up more and more often. And it will be confounding to traditional organizations like the International Olympic Committee to deal with that, because it's always sort of taken the idea that you have a nation state, and within the nation state, you create a National Olympic Committee, where you're going to be developing sporting communities that are based on the Indigenous personality, the Indigenous heritage of groups of people. To say, we have the Mohawk people that are going to compete in lacrosse, and we have the Australian Aboriginals that are going to compete in track and field. And so that perhaps in 20 years, when we relive this conversation, may be something that we'll be saying, well, gee, there's been this shift over time, and we were there and saw it start.
Seminal human rights, you mentioned, that the link in the 8, that was a real moment of crystallization of the opportunity, but also the challenges we face. Other, you've referenced Munich, clearly. What are some of the other moments where you think they were the most impactful, maybe for the world, or had the most transformational outcome change?
Go ahead, Ange. I've gone first the last couple of questions.
I was just going to say, for me personally, watching the women's marathon at the 1984 Olympics, the first time they're allowed to race. I mean, on the one hand, you're thinking, okay, so we go back to the ancient games and we also talk about the 1896, where the women had to run the next day to be able to run, and the examples of the great pictures of the Boston Marathon and women trying to race in the Boston Marathon. So actually watching the marathon happening for women at the 1984 Olympics was profound for me. The marathon is so symbolic. It's symbolic of endurance. It's symbolic of women's fight, struggle. And it really was an important moment, I think, for women's rights. That's one of the ones that I think of off the top. But I loved the Irish example that you gave, Frank. I mean, isn't that beautiful? I think that's such a lovely example of others, athletes, recognizing the rights of others to participate and giving up their spot. Giving up their spot. That's great. I think those are really good examples.
Beautiful. Yeah, because it's the right thing to do. And it's in the spirit of sport at its real essence. Beautiful. And Frank, what about you? What are some real moments?
Well, it's a bit of a personal one. So in 2000, in East Timor, we worked with Right to Play to put on sport camp. And one of the kids that went to that Right to Play sport camp ran the women's marathon in Beijing in 2008. So literally going from being a refugee to being the only athlete representing their country in an Olympic Games in a marathon was pretty moving. That was a big moment for me.
Yeah, a real constellation of meaning. Gorgeous.
Yep.
Thank you. And thank you all. Thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor here and invite our participants. We have a nice small group, so we can turn on the mic. Just let me know if you would like to ask a question. You can put it in the chat or just turn your mic on and interrupt me. It's fine. I have a question for everybody. Before we wrap up, we'll go till about 1:30, so we have about 15 more minutes. But one, while I'm stalling and waiting for questions to come in, is this idea of safe sport. Why is safe sport rearing? It's so strong right now. Yes, we had doping, but this safe sport is exploding and imploding in many ways. Sexual assault, but also the bullying, maltreatment. We now have a universal code in Canada. Where do you think that's coming from, or why? What's going on?
Yeah, it's the U.S. gymnastics experience. That was the linchpin that moved it forward. And we've not been immune to it in Canada. We've seen it in skiing. We've seen it in water polo. I've dealt with cases with Athletics Canada where there's been lengthy historic sexual abuse cases. And I think society is just at a place where it's that fairness thing. It's just not fair for kids going into sport to be sexually abused.
Seeing it in pro sport as well, right, with Babcock and Dave Scott Thomas. We've got the artistic swimming class actions right now from all the skating, so many. What do you think, Angela? What are your theories on that?
I think there is a new level of awareness and consciousness about that. And I think Frank's right to point to the US gymnastics as sort of being a breaking point, but also really, if you look at the work of Celia Brackenridge and Sandy Kirby trying to create Safe Sport International a while ago, it's people have been trying to raise the flag, if you will, and say, hey folks, we have to address the vulnerable. And I think what people, I don't know, I may be wrong, but my read on this is that people did not realize how vulnerable some of these athletes are.
Yeah.
The vulnerability of the situation and the power imbalance. And the lack of vetting of the responsibilities of the coaching selection, because it's just because you can produce gold medal teams doesn't mean you're qualified to coach, right? You've got a human being in your hands that you're molding. And in fact, that's got to be part of the criteria and the selection for coaches. And I think because of the volunteer element, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, we need volunteers because we don't have enough money or funding for coaches. We need volunteers. But on the other hand, because we have volunteers, there's less accountability on the volunteers. Now that's been changing and that's been getting better. But historically, I think that's been part of the problem with getting some teeth to address some of the issues.
Because some board members are volunteers and they're held accountable. Usually, there's no excuse there just because you're a volunteer. Yes, and the vulnerable, the power imbalance, how do we bring that power in, and the awareness, but also the culture, right? What we accept or expect from sport. I'm really learning that people expect it to be incredibly damaging. And if you can survive it, you're a real athlete, which is interesting. And any other comments on that? Okay.
There is an online question from Helene.
Yeah. Good. So we'll move to Hélène, and she's asking, how can we leverage the right to play model to foster those same experiences in Canada, specifically in regards to leveraging sport in reconciliation?
Becky Scott's model. Becky Scott's model with the cross-country skiing with the Indigenous kids.
True North.
Yes, I was drawing a blank.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful model. Oh, and some of well, that's one. I'm sure there's more, Frank. I'm sure you know more, but that's one that immediately comes to mind for me.
Yeah.
Right to play actually does operate in some Indigenous communities in Canada. They're actually headquartered in Canada. They're international headquarters, and they do have programs that go out. But it is something that does need more. Sport for development needs more development. And it gets down to this access isn't a matter of equality, access is a matter of equity. And there are certainly equity issues in terms of the provision of sport infrastructure in Indigenous communities. When you've got communities that are under 20-year-long boil water advisories, you're not necessarily worried about having water to make the hockey rink. So there are other, in the hierarchy of things, there are other things that need to get solved along the way. And I think that's one of those things where you're going to be looking at public, private, and volunteer partnerships to move and cure some of these things. And I think there's a need for role modeling that's going to help. Johan Koss is a Norwegian speed skater, probably doesn't speak as much to an Indigenous community as Jordan Tutu. So it's developing the role models that are then going to help deliver the programs, and I think that's still a work in progress.
So coming back to the athletes, right, and having them play a role, expecting that of athletes, that you're an Olympian or an athlete. As an athlete, you also need to be a leader, because that's what an athlete is. Yeah. And sorry.
I was just going to say, Jen, from the focus group we held at Royal Roads, that what was identified during that session with the Indigenous group was that the coaches expressed a concern of the lack of training, because, Frank, they're dealing with so many other issues. They almost need to be a social worker on top of being a coach. So, it's not that I'm just going to teach you how to play this sport. I have to make sure you have food. I have to make sure you have shoes. I have to make sure that you're not getting hurt. I have outside, off the pitch. So, and that issue has been something that's sort of fallen off the table in the uptake in training and trying to get people qualified and understanding the gap, Jen, you were talking about. So when a coach comes in and they've got their level 4 certification, they're thinking, oh, I'm going to help this group and I want to help this group, and not having a clue about that gap and that cultural differences and challenges.
There's a wonderful movie called The Grizzlies that shows up on Crave, and it's all about a teacher who played lacrosse in university going up to a northern community and teaching the kids lacrosse and doing that sport for development stuff. But again, it speaks to the power of the individual. It doesn't necessarily have to be an athlete. It just has to be someone who cares. A lot of the programs that are going to be developed in the UNHCR camps around the world aren't being delivered or developed by athletes. They're just being developed by people who care, who want to help, who want to say, come to the soccer game and then we're going to give you vaccines. And if you get a vaccine, we're going to give you a t-shirt that's got a soccer ball on it. And that really means something. And so it induces that kind of involvement. And it's a matter of picking and choosing how you can use sport for development messages in dealing with the thing that you want to deal with. So how does sport for development help in maternal health? And if maternal health isn't an issue, why are you doing sport for development that actually deals with maternal health? It's like the idea that you send knitted woolen gloves to Africa. Do they really need them? It's nice that they have them, but do they really need them? You actually have to be thoughtful and focused on how you use sport for development to bring development. So you have to pick stuff that's workable and cheap and sustainable. So we work with Right to Play and we develop sport kits to bring to villages and to refugee camps. They consisted of soccer balls and pumps, basketball hoops and balls, and volleyballs and nets. Because it's simple infrastructure. It's easy to, use a pump to fill up a ball. Now you're in a northern community at 30 below, that ball is going to be very flat, not bounce very. So again, you got to target. You got to think, what is it that's going to work here? Is it an indoor thing? And so it's all about what you want to do, why you want to do it, and what's the best way to get it done.
And minding that gap first, right? Getting to know.
Yeah.
And I love that you clarified, it doesn't have to be an athlete. I'd love to see the athletes, expect more of themselves, but it's every participant in sport. Hey, we've arrived at that at Royal Roads too, that it's not student-centered learning, it's learning-centered learning. Like we're all learners. We're researchers, everybody's learning. This was an institution of learning. So if you're diving into learning, everybody's a learner. Same with sport, the official, the coach, the spectator, the parent, the supporter, the athlete, everybody's a participant. And so we all have this duty to live up to the principles and ethics. Now we have a lovely message from Howard Stupp here. Frank, you might want to read.
Oh.
And she had a comment.
Oh, well, no, read how I think I've met Howard a long, long time ago. I don't know if it's the case, but please read what he's written.
Do you think that the values seen in sport are improving, getting worse, or generally staying the same, keeping in mind that the world seems to be becoming more and more complicated? Yeah. What do you think?
I think there's subcultures in some sports where it's not. And I think that is a part of the culture that we haven't been able to penetrate and educate and make an impact in. But I do think we are seeing improvements. We look at, you know, the issue, you gave some great examples at the outset, Jen, with the women's soccer and pay equity and the questions about equity. We've made some great progress there. So I do think things are getting better on that front for sure. But there are some that are staying the same, absolutely. And there are some very resistant cultures in international sport. And also, to be frank, there's some corruption going on, you know, and that's a tough nut to crack. So I think the important thing is we need to separate that from sport itself. Because what happens is the labeling and the painting of the brush is so broad here that the entire sport enterprise itself gets blamed, as opposed to the individuals that are promulgating the culture and allowing the corruption to continue.
Promulgating, right? The Olympics is so commodified. It's not the Olympics, it's the people who are manipulating it. Yes. Frank, comments on that?
I think you know, different IFs, different sports have different cultures, and some, you know, I love lawn bowls. Lawn bowls is the only sport in its hosting agreement that says you have to have a beer fridge. you know, like that's a sport culture I really like. You're not going to see a lot of doping in lawn bowls. You're going to see them having a beer after in the clubhouse. So it's different, and I think there's high risk stuff. You know, like we talked earlier about the Gaddafis, you know, killing soccer coaches because they're beheading soccer coaches, however they did it, because they lost games. You know, that's on a complete different edge. But that's specific to that country and not even that culture. That's just that family that happened to be the ruling family at the time. The Brunei example of women not being able to participate in a whole lot of sport. So that's completely different. You know, we and then you get it, like take America. You know, the Black Lives Matter movement, the whole impact that's had on its society and on sport and inequity in sport, and the scholarship system and the NCAA and how that impacts. So that whole idea of sport in the United States is probably totally different than it is in Egypt, where university is free if you can qualify to go to university. So it's country-based. I think it's different in sport. You know, equestrian sports are probably really different than wrestling in terms of their cultures. There have been horse doping things, but it's not very frequent. And I think it depends on what's happened. Like Canada's gone through this amazing metamorphosis in the last 3 years. The rise of safe sport, the national safe sport conferences, the Bennett report into wrestling, the appointment of commissioners in different sports, the idea that there's going to be a safe sport office somewhere in Canada that looks at safe sport issues, anti-corruption things that are being looked at by governments. You know, my first posting with the RCMP was in Montreal, and of course it was shortly after the Summer Olympics there. And you know, the idea that the mafia controlled the construction industry in Montreal, and they'd be dump trucks full of cement to the Big O, and they'd fail the viscosity test at the Olympic Stadium, but then the same dump truck would immediately drive out to the suburbs and be poured into basements. You know, so you know, even we as a country have not been immune to these corruptive forces of money and power and the things. So it's a great question, Howard, and that's probably somebody's doctoral thesis
Absolutely. And we have one last question. I was trying to create a little poll, but I think I had to do that beforehand. For should the Olympics go ahead this year? What do you think? We'll finish off with that question. Thoughts, Angie? Should it go ahead?
Wow, you know, so I have serious debates with my colleagues on this, right? It is really split down the line. I have many colleagues coming from health policy saying this is just an ego trip, folks. You should be shutting this baby down. Like, what are you doing? You know, your risk, look what's happening. On the other hand, the incredible resilience that the Japanese people have gone through, and the organizing committee and the work they've put in, and they basically took a 747 jet that was going full steam and put it into a holding pattern for one whole year and have now got it going again. And it's been extraordinary, you know, the stories around that. On the other hand, you have the Japanese people in general on the ground that are worried about the safety for themselves, quite rightly so. I think it's a really, really seriously challenging problem. And I don't think that we have all the information. That's the problem. Like, I don't think we really have clear probabilities on the risks right now because of what's happened with this new variants that have come out. So, I mean, if you'd asked me this a month ago, Jen, I would have said yes.
Right.
But today, when I'm seeing on our own campus 12 outbreaks and the younger populations getting hospitalized in the ICU, it's affecting them. Wow, this is a really tough situation.
Yeah. And in such a race with those variants. And Frank, thoughts? And you can see the results of the poll now.
Yeah, I think I'm in I didn't vote, but I'm in that 57%. I mean, there's just so many data points out there that we don't know. And what was good data a month ago may not be good data. I mean, I think it was wise for the organizing committee and the government to say we're not going to allow tourists in. It's going to be a Japanese only thing. And it gets really one of the interesting ethical questions about Tokyo is, should athletes jump the queue to get vaccines before they go, you know, and that's a huge ethical question. If you're a supporter of sport in the Olympics, you'll think about it. But if you've got an 80-year-old grandmother that's waiting for her second jab, you may want that extra vial to stay in the community. So there's lots of ethical questions to consider about that yet, and especially because we don't really know. I was listening to CBC Radio yesterday. They're not really sure yet of the efficacy of the vaccines with respect to the variants. You may be perfectly vaccinated against the original COVID-19, but the new variants, I mean, there's just a new one that came out this week. You may not be. And then you take a look at the world risk. You've got these 10,000 athletes, 25,000 people probably in total, with the officials and the coaches and the judges and the support staff and the ACOG television people, broadcast, that are going to be in Tokyo and then going to go back into their place in the world. And that's a huge amount of quarantining. And you know, people aren't going to do it. So it's a really tough question. I wouldn't want to be the person doing it. And there's an interesting tension, I think, as well, because there are two bodies of decision makers. One is the government of Japan, and the other one's the IOC. And it's kind of, in a way, it's a question of who blinks first in terms of the liability. If the IOC says we're going to cancel the games, well, then somebody's got to reimburse Japan for everything they've done. If Japan blinks first, then how does the IOC deal with all of its broadcast revenue sharing, and you know, there's bigger questions. They're not bigger questions. There are more questions at play.
Yeah.
That deal with, and then you've got the disappointment of 10,000 athletes. You know, there are some that it's their ultimate games, or their first and only games. There are athletes I know that were going to retire after Tokyo 2020 that are staying on through Tokyo 2021, and there are athletes who are peaking in 2021 that wouldn't have gone to 2020 that are hunting the same spots. Mm-hmm. And in the work that I do, I'm dealing with these sorts of things of saying, folks, you know, like, who's going to go? You know, do we pick the guy that was first last year, or do we pick the guy that's first now? And so really tough decisions.
And fairness, a question of fairness. And the public perception of this is really interesting, because I don't think that many people realize that a very small percentage of athletes go to 2 Olympiads. It's not the majority. It's not like, oh, well, we're missing the Stanley Cup this year. Well, no, that's not what's happening. You know, it's so I think that there's some misunderstandings by those that think this isn't a big deal for athletes. They can just get over it. Yeah, I mean, especially if you look at sports like female gymnastics, like that's, you know, very often it is, you know, there is a limited time period. Skeet shooters, you know, a little different. Some of them do 7 or 8 Olympics, but there are some where, you know, you've got that 1 year or 2 year window in your life where you're going to be able to do your thing, and that's it. Yeah,
and how much do we value that pursuit? And I love how we've come full circle to the whole, right? Which is what you're both masters at seeing the whole challenge and trying to balance all the elements. And we're left in this very indecisive place in the middle, trying to get all the answers. So too, like, we're still busy trying to get more answers to the many, many questions that keep emerging.
So what Socrates said on that, Jen, what he said on that is that although we've come to a point where we don't have an answer to the original question that we started with, we do understand the implications so much more, and the complexity so much more, and the nature of the question. So, and that's important. So it can, for people that have to make the decisions on the policy today, that's not something that's very comforting, but it is important from an ethics perspective.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the whole problem. That's Wertheimer too. A more penetrating view of the problem. Love it. Well, I have to say goodbye. I don't want to. We could keep going, open up a bottle of wine and keep chatting. We should probably connect again. That was an amazing conversation. So many great insights, so much information that you're so wise, but also so knowledgeable, and sharing your knowledge of this topic, of how it plays out across the world. We really appreciate your time, and it will be recorded. Of course, it is recorded. We will send that out. So please share it with anybody who wasn't able to attend or is interested in the topic. I think this was quite a gem of a webinar. Thank you both.